This next panel, America 250, is going to explore the Declaration's place in our judiciary, what it means to the judiciary. Moderating our panel, someone who needs a little introduction. It's Justice Sarah Warren, the presiding justice of our Supreme Court, and I will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you all for being here. It is a great pleasure to be on stage with this distinguished panel. I'm going to start with Judge Willett for our introductions. Let me say that you all probably know these folks at the panel. They're all highly esteemed in their fields. They're actually all dear friends of mine, and they all actually have multiple degrees from Duke, and so I'm sorry, I've revealed my bias. I'm not that sorry about it. These are really wonderful panelists. So let me start with Judge Willett. I'd also like to introduce Judge Willett's slacks. Could you please model for us? It is. This was a surprise to me, so we did not plan this. Is it the Constitution or the Declaration or both?
Declaration.
It is the Declaration of Independence on his red, white, and blue slacks.
Looks like freedom.
It does.
Life tenure is a beautiful thing.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. What a great surprise. All right, Judge Willett has traveled from Austin, Texas. He is an extremely busy person, and so we are so grateful that he is joining us today. He is a Texan through and through. He graduated from Baylor University and was the first in his family to graduate from college. He has since earned 3 degrees from Duke University, a JD with honors, a master's in political science, and an LLM in judicial studies. He clerked on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the court on which he now serves, and he's held multiple jobs in national and state public service before being appointed to the Texas Supreme Court, where he served for more than 12 years. He was appointed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in 2017. Judge Willett and his wife Tiffany have 3 children. It's also important to him that I mention his dog Amicus, who could not be with us today. There are some other really fun facts about Judge Willett. In 2015, he was named the Tweeter Laureate of Texas. He is a former bull rider. He is a professional drummer. This is like the list of things where you're like, which one of these is not true? But apparently they are all true. And my favorite is that he has an elementary school named after him. That is a true fact because I have a t-shirt that says Willett Elementary on it. All right, hard to follow that, but we will move to Professor Chapman here to my left. He is the Associate Dean for Faculty and Development and the Agus Cleveland Distinguished Chair of Law at the University of Georgia Law School. Professor Chapman hails from Missouri outside of Kansas City. Teaching and writing about constitutional law, religion, and ethics, he has been on faculty at UGA Law since 2013. He graduated from Belmont University, Duke University School of Law, and Duke Divinity School. He clerked on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals for Judge Joe Flatt, and then went on to serve as the executive director of the Stanford Constitutional Law Center. I actually think he has a lot of awards and accolades. I know he got at least one when we were in law school together, but I could not find them on his biography. So I don't know if that's modesty or if he's just scrubbed the internet, but he is a highly acclaimed professor and academic. He's also a prolific writer, and he has authored a book called Agreeing to Disagree: How the Establishment Clause Promotes Religious Pluralism and Protects Freedom of Conscience. And he's an acclaimed teacher. The graduating classes at UGA Law have honored him twice with the C. Ronald Ellington Award for Excellence in Teaching and the Lonnie C. Brown Award for Professionalism. And this is my fun fact about Professor Chapman. I barely know what it means. He is currently studying the conceptual and theological underpinnings of disestablishment of religion across the Anglophone world from 1776 to 1832. We'll quiz you about that later.
Thanks for calling it fun.
Yeah. All right, presiding Judge Stephen Dillard of the Georgia Court of Appeals. Judge Dillard is a presiding judge on the Georgia Court of Appeals, where he has served since 2010. He was appointed to the bench by then Governor Sonny Perdue and has since been reelected statewide 3 times. He's a former chief judge of that court. Judge Dillard graduated from Stanford University. Do we have any bulldogs, that kind of bulldog in the crowd? Yes? Okay. He is a big Stanford football fan. And he graduated, sorry. Well, we got to hang in there. He graduated with honors from the Mississippi College School of Law. He clerked on the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals for Judge Mannion, and he earned an LLM in judicial studies from Duke University. Judge Dillard and his wife, Krista, are proud parents of 3 children. And he is also a laureate. There is some debate on whether you're a Twitter laureate as opposed to a tweeter laureate, but y'all can hash that out later. But he was named a Twitter laureate in 2019 for the state of Georgia. Judge Dillard has a well-known presence on social media and has done extensive work in making the judiciary more accessible to lawyers and lay people alike. And for this and for other reasons, Judge Dillard will be awarded the William H. Rehnquist Award for Judicial Excellence later this year. It is one of the highest judicial recognitions in the country. So, great panel, and what we're going to do is I'm going to give a couple of background refresher points on the Declaration of Independence, and then we're going to turn it over so that each of our panelists can have a few minutes to make their own remarks. They each have some really interesting perspectives and thoughts to share, and our hope is to have some time at the end of the panel to open up for questions. So before we get into that, a refresher on the Declaration. I actually spent a little bit of time doing a history lesson for myself, and whether you're willing to admit it or not, most of us have probably forgotten a lot of the important stuff that we learned in our history classes in high school or in college. And unfortunately, as the Chief Justice alluded to earlier, there's so much we take for granted about the structure and the rule of law that exists in our country. And I think one of the things that we often take for granted is the Declaration of Independence. And as we're approaching the 250th anniversary, we're going to try to take it for granted less and remember what it's all about. So the First Continental Congress convened on September 5th, 1774, in response to the coercive acts, the forced quartering of British soldiers, the closure of the British harbor, and the crackdown on colonial legislative power. The Continental Congress developed a petition of grievances against King George III. After the battles at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, many in the colonies thought that they would be able to secure their rights within the British Empire. And in the summer of 1775, the Second Continental Congress, which was the first Continental Congress to which Georgians attended, they drafted and sent to the king the Olive Branch Petition, which was a last attempt at reconciliation. You all probably have figured out that that did not work. It did not win the heart of King George III. He proclaimed instead that the colonies were in a state of rebellion. Battles and skirmishes continued, with many colonists still believing that reconciliation was possible. And then Thomas Paine's Common Sense was published in January of 1776, and that swayed many colonists' hearts towards independence. June 1776 rolls around, and the first independence resolution was introduced at the Second Continental Congress. That was introduced by Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee, and it was called the Lee Resolution. A vote on the Lee Resolution was postponed, and a committee of 5 was created to draft a Declaration of Independence. That committee was spearheaded by Thomas Jefferson, who was the primary drafter, and also included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. And then by July 1776, things really started moving. On July 1st, the Lee Resolution that was still pending at that time failed to pass. But then one day later, on July 2nd, the Second Continental Congress was able to reach consensus, and the colonies voted unanimously, minus New York, which abstained, in favor of the resolution. On July 4th, after some rounds of debate and edits, the Declaration was approved, though not every delegate signed it on that date. 56 delegates signed it on various dates after July the 4th. So the Declaration is not actually divided into formal sections, although there are color blocks on Judge Willett's slacks, which suggest otherwise. But you all probably think of, when you look at the Declaration, the introduction and the preamble, which is typically the most famous part. But there's also a list of grievances contained in it. There is actually a list of grievances against the king, and that is part of the Declaration. And that's followed by an actual formal Declaration of Independence. A couple of Georgia points about the Declaration of Independence, and I think Judge Dillard will cover some of this ground later as well. But once it was published, the Declaration of Independence quickly made its way to Georgia, and that is not just metaphorical. On August 10th, 1776, a messenger arrived in Savannah, which was then the capital of Georgia, with a letter from John Hancock, who was the president of the Continental Congress, and with a copy of the Declaration. Archibald Bullock, who was the president of the Provincial Congress, then publicly read out loud the Declaration of Independence multiple times. That was the reading out loud was to the Provincial Congress, and then to a mass of people who had gathered in the public square in Savannah, and finally to the provincial militia, which saluted its reading with 13 volleys from the field pieces with shots into the air. So I think that's a good way to tie things into Georgia, but before we get into all of the brass tacks of how Georgia thinks about the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Chapman, who will educate us about the Declaration of Independence and natural rights.
Thanks very much. It's such a privilege to be here and a delight. I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical context of the Declaration. And I want to make the case that this is a really important, legible, but radical constitutional document. So what was it initially? It was something that the patriots, and I'll just use the term patriots to refer to the Americans who were rebels as opposed to the loyalists or those who were moderates. It was the patriots' attempt to try to explain not only to George III, not only to themselves, but to the moderates, to the loyalists, and even to sort of France and the other North Atlantic countries who were watching, what they thought the new relationship was between the new states and England. It was first and foremost a constitutional document. It wasn't a rejection of the English Constitution. Most of them admired the English Constitution, and they relied on what they believed the English Constitution to be as a justification for why they were entitled to rebel. Yet, they felt that they had actually been eliminated from the English Constitution, and they had no choice. Let me read just a little bit of the preamble, and then in sort of good originalist fashion, I suppose, argue that we have to understand the political jurisprudential backdrop to be able to understand why they thought all of their listeners were going to understand this, right? From Georgia to Paris, folks were going to understand what they were talking about. And then I want to talk about why some of them thought they were completely nuts, right? So they could both understand it, and it was incendiary at the same time. Okay, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Everybody they were talking to understood what that meant. The only places of disagreement was about how it applied to their situation. So, three sort of backdrop components of the English Constitution that were widely understood. And this is going to be at a pretty high level of abstraction. I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A if you have some questions. But the first of these is that natural law was real. It was part of the English Constitution. It was part of the law that governed all people. It wasn't just sort of self-evident because you could look around and see it, but because they had all inherited a long tradition of this. They took it for granted. It wasn't controversial at the time. It was the law that said that all people are sort of by nature free and equal. And it was the result of God's creation and his sort of purpose for human beings in the world. Part of the law said that all people had certain natural rights. They also had certain natural duties. That's part of the equation that we sometimes sort of leave out today, but the rights were the flip side of duties. The second component of this was less jurisprudential, and it was more a matter of political theory. So interwoven with the notion of natural rights was a commitment to popular sovereignty, and in particular, the theory that the social compact was the basis of a legitimate government. And across the North Atlantic, especially in the Protestant nations, everybody would have taken both of these things for granted. People entered into a compact for government in order to protect their natural rights, They gave the government the authority to enforce those rights, which entailed giving up the right to enforce it themselves. And this was from basically Richard Hooker all the way to Tom Paine. Within this vast tradition, folks would have recognized this and agreed. And what made Englishmen separate, of course, or unique, was that a big component of their constitution, the most important sort of on-the-ground component, were positive customary rights of Englishmen. So these were rights dating back to Magna Carta and even before, and they're rights that are positive in the sense that they aren't natural rights. They're rights that arise in a particular political society, and they're customary in the sense that they're not necessarily written down, but they are sort of unshakable because of long tradition. Think of the right of trial by jury, habeas corpus. Even things like the separation of powers would have been understood to be part of the customary constitution that protected natural rights. Those three things were interwoven, and Americans and Englishmen, for that matter, sort of would talk about constitutional rights using the language of all three kind of interchangeably in ways that are kind of really foreign, I think, to a legal culture like ours, where we're used to talking about constitutional rights principally by saying, well, what does the text of the Constitution say? We're going to focus on sort of that and then whatever derivative doctrine we've got. Not exactly the same. So everybody would have agreed about this stuff. What made this incendiary or radical? Well, that was because the Americans had a particular view. The Patriots had a particular view of this that I think they may not have understood was as weird within the sort of transatlantic community they were part of as it was. It was a view that emphasized rights of conscience in a way that the rights of conscience were part of this component for everyone, natural rights, and everybody understood they were unalienable. And yet, Americans in particular focused on the fact that this is beyond the government's ability to reach. Now, rights of conscience don't directly show up in the Declaration of Independence. You may be wondering why I'm talking about it. Well, the idea that you would break away from a sort of imperial power that was a combination of church and state is only imaginable, really, if you don't believe that an established church is necessary for the proper functioning of a government. So the only way they could even imagine declaring independence is by saying, actually, we think the liberty of conscience is prior and more important to the government having the power to determine this stuff. So Americans were sort of on the far edge on liberty of conscience, and that was more prominently displayed in state constitutions. So almost every state constitution had really important front and center in their declarations of rights provisions about this. Another thing that made them weird was they had a very Lockean view of the people's reserved right to revolt in the event the government was failing to adequately protect their rights. We take Locke's view, I think, for granted in America because it is sort of our heritage. It was definitely a minority view in England. So folks like Burke might have thought it was persuasive, but most folks did not, and a lot of Americans didn't find it persuasive either. But of course, if you think that's important, or at least viable as an argument, it explains why something like the Declaration is even possible. And finally, the Americans thought they were entitled to all the rights of Englishmen. And their views of what those rights were pretty traditional and conservative and really related back more to the late 18th century. But they were kind of behind the times compared to what the Brits expected of those rights. So in many respects, the Americans in that respect were much more conservative, much more committed to what they thought was the rule of law as it applied to them, whereas the Brits by then were used to a slightly more evolving constitutional situation. Parliament had a lot more sort of sovereignty to decide what the law was going to be, and the Americans said, well, we're entitled to everything that you're entitled to in England. George, if you're not going to protect us, we're going to indict you, basically. And so the rest of that document is a bill of particulars against the Crown for failing to protect their natural rights and their rights as Englishmen. So thanks very much for letting me talk at you for a while. I'm really delighted to hear the rest of the folks and to answer any questions.
Thanks, that was wonderful. Judge Willett, we will turn to you.
All right. Thank you, Justice Warren. Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it. So it's only 275 days from today when we're going to celebrate America's birth announcement, the greatest breakup letter of all time, a quarter millennium. Who knows the official term for what that is?
Isn't it like sesquicentennial?
The semi-quincentennial. The semi-quincentennial. And I think it's an occasion worthy of far more than fireworks. I think it really deserves some reverent reflection. Because the Declaration, it was no, as you heard, it was no run-of-the-mill political statement. As Jefferson put it, he called it an expression of the American mind. And when those 56 delegates signed the Declaration, they did a lot more than sever ties with Britain. They launched a radical experiment, a totally new way of thinking about human beings, of thinking about human government. They declared independence not only from Britain, but from the old order of power itself. And they proclaimed to the world that liberty is not a gift from Parliament. It's not a concession of kings. It is an endowment from the Creator himself. So the Declaration unveiled what Professor Barnett at Georgetown calls a uniquely American theory of government, that first come rights and then comes government. So for the first time in history, a nation came into being based on this claim that every human being possesses inborn, individual, natural rights and equality. And that is the revolutionary heart of the Declaration, that rights are not provided by government. Rights pre-exist government. Jefferson called them unalienable. They're so hardwired into our humanity that no monarch and no legislature and no majority can erase them. So that was radical then, it's radical now. For most of human history, rulers claimed the exact opposite. This was an age of kings and sultans around the globe. And they believed that rights were handed down from above. And the Declaration flipped the script. And it said rights do not flow down from the crown. They are inborn. They are not bestowed. They are God-given, and they're not government-given. And that is why the recent claim of a sitting U.S. senator that our rights come from government isn't just wrong, it's just laughably, preposterously apolitical and dangerous. The Declaration could not be plainer. It is there on the first page, right? The first sentence on the first page. Endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, not granted by Congress, not bestowed by kings, endowed by their Creator. I mean, if rights come from politicians, then politicians can take them away. And that's just monarchy in disguise. That's the very tyranny the founders were revolting against. They weren't swapping one master for another. They were declaring that no man is master. So Abraham Lincoln, I think, understood this better than anybody since Jefferson. So he called the Declaration the apple of gold. You've heard this metaphor. The Declaration, the apple of gold, set within the silver frame of the Constitution. And the Constitution provides the structure, and the Declaration provides the promise. And one is architectural, and the other is aspirational. So Lincoln knew full well that the promise was unfulfilled, that America's original sin of slavery, it really did mock the very words that all men are created equal. but he clung to those words, he clung to those ideals because they were true, and they were timeless, and they were transformative, and he would not abandon them even to avoid civil war. And those words armed Frederick Douglass with moral thunder, and they inspired Dr. King to call the Declaration a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. And I think 2.5 centuries later, those words and those ideals, they still represent our North Star. And of course, the truths of the Declaration are self-evident, but they're not self-executing. Slavery endured. Jefferson's original draft included a pretty forceful denunciation of slavery, and that was struck out. A third of the signers of the Declaration owned slaves. There was a pretty radical disconnect between the commendable words of the Declaration and the condemnable deeds of those who signed it. And Frederick Douglass, he rightly called out the hypocrisy. But nonetheless, he hailed the Declaration. He called it a glorious liberty document, insisting that those ideals were eternal. They were waiting to be realized, and they were a foundation on which abolition and civil rights could be built. And Dr. King made the same plea a century later. He implored Americans not to tear down the nation's heritage, but to live up to it. So I think for every generation, the Declaration serves as both a mirror and a map. It exposes our failures, but I think it also kind of guides our progress. And yet, on the cusp of this epic anniversary, how many of our fellow Americans even know this story? I mean, we inhabit this age of really staggering civic illiteracy. Our civics IQ is not exactly Mensa level. A few years ago, my daughter was then in 4th grade, and she memorized the Declaration of Independence. Not just the iconic preamble that we all more or less know, when in the course of human events, ... Every word she memorized. And I think today many Americans can't even name the 3 branches of government. And 71% of Americans can't identify the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. 10% of college graduates in America think Judge Judy sits on the Supreme Court. But I think when civic memory fades, I say civic affection begins to fade too, it evaporates. And I think forgetfulness is a prelude to failure. And George Washington was pretty prescient, and in his very first inaugural, he warned of this. He said this, what he called the sacred fire of liberty was entrusted to the American people. And we've all heard the Franklin quip as he's exiting Independence Hall, 1787. Mrs. Powell rushes up, "What have we got, doctor?" And his famous kind of razor-sharp reply was, "A republic if you can keep it." And I think that keeping depends on remembering, because I think it's a short trip from ignorance of our founding ideals to erasure of those ideals. So I think as we mark 250 years, I think our task is not just to commemorate, but to recommit, to teach and to tell and to remind and to rekindle. The Declaration wasn't written for glass cases and classroom posters. It was written for us, for every generation charged with keeping the Republic. The Declaration is not a relic. It is a mission statement. And the promises in it are not just platitudes. They're marching orders. And the real question is, do we still believe all of that? Do we believe those promises? Do we believe that rights are ours by virtue of our very humanity? Do we believe that liberty is unalienable and not negotiable? Do we still believe, as Lincoln did, that the apple of gold must be guaranteed by the frame of silver? So again, the Declaration, the self-evident truths are not self-executing. In a republic, it comes with responsibility, and every generation has to take its turn. And here we are, 250 years later, and I think cynicism runs pretty high, and trust runs pretty low. Our civic temperature is high, but our civic IQ is not super high. But the Declaration still stands, and I think its words remain bold and bracing and necessary. So say this iconic passage with me. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That single line is the greatest political sentence ever written in English. So my hope is that as we mark this birthday, that we'll do so not only with fireworks, but with fidelity. Fidelity to the truth that freedom is God's gift, not government's favor. Fidelity to the truth that government exists only to secure what God has given us. And fidelity to the truth that we, the people, remain responsible for keeping our republic. I'm all for fireworks, but as they sort of light up the sky next July, I pray that we'll remember that what truly sustains this nation is not pyrotechnics, but principles that will marry the celebration with conviction. Because anybody can cheer for freedom one night, and we should, but I think it takes courage and grit to live it out day by day and to see the Declaration not as a dusty document, but as a living commitment. So on that score, I pray that we'll all take a measure of heart and inspiration from one of the signers of the Declaration. His name was Stephen Hopkins. He was from Rhode Island, and he was afflicted with palsy, and his hand literally shook as he signed the Declaration. Yet he said this, "My hand trembles, but my heart does not." And that was the spirit of 1776. It was fidelity in the face of adversity. So I pray the same will be said of us, and I pray that America 250 will not merely be a birthday party, but that it'll be a real summons for all of us to reckon anew with the Declaration's really sacred and really world-changing truths.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Judge Willett. That's a wonderful reminder to think of the Declaration as a mission statement that needs to be remembered and lived out even today. We're going to turn it over to Judge Dillard. I am so curious about your props,
Yeah,
so I hope you will tell us what they're about
yeah, I will.
and tie this all together for us.
I'll try. All right. So my task today, as I understand it, is to have us to consider the textual, structural, and historical interplay between the Declaration of Independence and Georgia's constitutional history. This is a Georgia conference, after all, so at least some discussion of our state's constitutional history and how it relates to the Declaration of Independence seems entirely appropriate. But I want to begin with just a bit of a historical foundation, and that's Georgia's original charter from 1732. The charter was granted by King George II, and it was certainly monarchical in tone, but it did contain some rather interesting pre-constitutional language. For example, the charter provided that any laws and ordinances of the colony needed to be, quote, reasonable and not contrary or repugnant to the laws or statutes of this our realm. This implies the colonists possessed certain protections of English rights and liberties. And later in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson emphasized that the colonists were entitled to certain rights by virtue of being Englishmen via natural law. So when the Declaration complained that the king had violated these rights, it did so based on the assumption also present in our charter that the colonists were entitled to these liberties. Next, we have the 1776 Rules and Regulations of the Georgia Colony, which became operational on May 1st, 1776, and are often characterized as a proto-constitution or the state's first constitutional framework. They are notable because they were adopted just a few months before the Declaration of Independence as a stopgap measure until a permanent constitution could be ratified. Put another way, they established the bare essentials of a functioning government and significantly provided no explicit mention of individual rights. Even so, these rules and regulations noted that, quote, the good people of America, close quote, had been pushed by the British, quote, to take up arms as their last resource for the preservation of their rights and liberties which God and the Constitution gave them, and that they were instituting these measures as, quote, the representatives of the people with whom all power originates and for whose benefit all government is intended, deeply impressed with a sense of duty to their constituents, of love to their country, and attachment to the liberties of America. These stirring patriotic themes, of course, also appeared in the Declaration of Independence, which notes the necessity of the American people dissolving the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, and that there are certain self-evident truths, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Provincial Congress responsible for drafting these rules and regulations initially planned on convening in Savannah, but ended up being in Augusta due to the looming threat of a British invasion. Unsurprisingly, these rules and regulations included many of the principles and grievances outlined in the Declaration of Independence. For example, both documents emphasized the need for government by consent of the people, the importance of equal political participation, the need for limits on executive power, the importance of individual liberties, and the need for a complete break from the English monarchy. Indeed, the city of Savannah's reaction to the Declaration in August of 1776, which Presiding Judge Justice Warren mentioned, speaks volumes about the shifting sentiments in our state. After the Declaration was publicly read, Georgians, and this seems like a freedom tailgate, they conducted a mock funeral for King George III. They paraded with, I love Georgia, they paraded with a coffin for the king, and the procession included military companies. They proclaimed that, quote, and this is amazing, as George III hath most flagrantly violated his coronation oath, we therefore commit his political existence to the ground, corruption to corruption, tyranny to the grave, and oppression to eternal infamy. That's good stuff. This public display, yeah, clap, that's good stuff. This public display was a powerful celebration of Georgia's almost full embrace of independence. We had a few Tories that left the building. And we owe a debt of gratitude to three Georgian signers of the Declaration, Button Gwinnett, Lyman Hall, and George Walton, who John Adams characterized as intelligent and spirited men who made a powerful addition to our phalanx. So, after the 1776 rules and regulations, Georgia, since that time, has adopted not one, not two, but 10 constitutions. The 1777 Constitution, 1789, 1798, 1861, 1868, 1877, 1945, 1976, and 1983, our current Constitution. And significantly, it was not until the Declaration of Independence that the colonies considered themselves to be free and independent states. And thus, Georgia leadership considered our state to be a sovereign and independent commonwealth requiring a constitution. This is reflected in the preamble to the 1777 Constitution of the state of Georgia. So I'm going to read just a bit of it to further stir your patriotic souls. Whereas the conduct of the legislature of Great Britain for many years past has been so oppressive on the people of America that being repugnant to the common rights of mankind hath obliged the Americans as freemen to oppose such oppressive measures and to assert the rights and privileges they are entitled to by the laws of nature and reason, and to adopt such government as may, in the opinion of the representatives of the people, best conduce to the happiness and safety of their constituents in particular and America in general. And whereas the independence of the United States of America has also been declared, we therefore, the representatives of the people, from whom all power originates and for whose benefit all government is intended, by virtue of the power delegated to us, do ordain and declare that the following rules and regulations be adopted for the future government of this state. Notably, our first three constitutions were ratified during the Revolutionary era, and needless to say, there was a great deal going on during that time. The ratification of the federal Constitution took place in 1788. And a side note here, Georgia was what state? The fourth, there we go. Thank you, Justice Namias. The fourth state to ratify the federal Constitution. And there was also the ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1791, which was shortly after Georgia ratified its second Constitution. The next four state constitutions were all ratified during the Civil War, post-Civil War period, 1861, 1865, 1868, and 1877. But after that, we wouldn't see a new Georgia Constitution for 68 years, when we adopted a new one, once again, 1945. Georgia ratified another constitution in 1776, and our current constitution was ratified in 1983. Some of our earliest rights as Georgians were enshrined in the 1777 Constitution: freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of press, availability of the writ of habeas corpus, preservation of the right to jury trial, and the prohibition against excessive fines and bail. But let's fast forward to our current Constitution of 1983 and its wonderful preamble. To perpetuate the principles of free government, ensure justice to all, preserve peace, promote the interest and happiness of the citizen and of the family, and transmit to posterity the enjoyment of liberty, we, the people of Georgia, relying upon the protection and guidance of Almighty God, do ordain and establish this Constitution. Now, if you've never read through Article 1 of our current Constitution, you really should. It's not only a culmination of the previous 9 constitutions, especially in terms of enshrining many of the natural law rights widely recognized at the time of our founding, as well as more modern concepts of liberty like equal protection, but it also embeds in our Constitution, this is Article 1, Section 2, many of the foundational understandings of the nature of government in relation to we the people. Article 1, Section 2, the origin and foundation of government. Quote, all government of right originates with the people, is founded upon their will only, and is instituted solely for the good of the whole. Public officers are the trustees and servants of the people, and are at all times amenable to them. Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 2, object of government. Quote, the people of this state have the inherent right of regulating their internal government. Government is instituted for the protection, security, and benefit of the people, and at all times they have the right to alter or reform the same whenever the public good may require it. The Declaration of Independence, of course, lays out the philosophical underpinnings of these rights and concepts, emphasizing natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the necessity of the consent of the governed as the rightful source of any government authority, and the right of the people to abolish government when it violates their natural rights. So, from a judicial philosophy standpoint, how then should we think about the Declaration in relation to state constitutional interpretation? Does it help inform our understanding of certain state constitutional provisions only to the extent that there's a textual basis for doing so? Or can we use the Declaration as something akin to a historical interpretive presumption, much like Randy Barnett's broader presumption of liberty when it comes to the federal constitutional interpretation? Or is it just completely meaningless in interpreting the federal or Georgia constitutions? In many ways, this discussion about the Declaration's interpretive efficacy understandably mirrors the debates surrounding the Ninth Amendment, the state's baby ninths, as well as the federal and state's privileges or immunities clauses, because they all involve, to at least some extent, a consideration of natural law rights, which freaks people out. And all too often, legal scholars and commentators end up positing all or nothing approaches, which I think are deeply mistaken. The Ninth Amendment is not an ink blot, apologies to Robert Bork, but it's also not simply a vehicle for calling anything you want to do in life a retained right. The same goes for privileges or immunities, and there's no doubt a certain amount of overlap between these constitutional provisions. To be sure, the Declaration is unlike those constitutional provisions, not the law. Even so, what are we to make of the rights, protections, and concepts of government referred to in the Declaration of Independence? Again, many scholars tend to brush aside any suggestion that the Declaration has any meaning or bearing in understanding or interpreting the federal or our state constitutions. But I think that's a simplistic way and a misguided way of looking at things. As I've said before, in life and law, context is crucial. And I'm not sure how you can properly understand constitutional law, be it federal or state, without considering the foundational importance of the Declaration of Independence. I'm short on time, so I'll just quickly lay out my view. The Declaration of Independence isn't a separate source of positive law, but many of its ideals and concepts are enshrined in the federal and Georgia constitutions. As a result, this foundational document is certainly a source that legal scholars can and should rely on as a means of determining some constitutional provisions' original public meaning. Put another way, the Declaration is a special source of original public meaning because of its foundational character, but it doesn't necessarily have any greater weight than the Federalist, Eliot's debates, Foran's records of the Federal Convention of 1787, and the like, in ascertaining that meaning. Interestingly, the Declaration has only been mentioned or cited in 26 reported Georgia appellate decisions. Most of these decisions simply refer to the Declaration in passing, but there is one opinion that I think stands out from the rest, and it was written by one of Georgia's most prominent and preeminent judges. In CPF Investments, LLP versus Fulton County Board of Assessors, the author of the majority's unanimous panel opinion had this to say in response to a governmental board's cynical argument that, quote, the best interest of a governmental entity are not and can never be synonymous with the best interest of the public which that entity serves. This judge responded by saying, this argument is, quote, contrary to our fundamental understanding of government. As our founding fathers expressed in the Declaration of Independence, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that, quote, given these principles, and in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, we must assume that when a government agency acts to fulfill its duty to advance the public interest, it simultaneously advances its own interest. That author was Judge Lisa Branch, now of the 11th Circuit, and I think these wise words are a good place to end my remarks. Thank you.
All right, luckily we do have some time for questions. So while you're thinking, I can, oh, good, someone can already start us off.
Thank you all for your remarks and reminding us of the importance. Thank you. Thank you all for your remarks and for bringing this panel together, ma'am. How do you maintain, each one of you, if you can, a sense of optimism, given what we see particularly at the federal level, which seems to be motivated by, at best, a very, very superficial understanding of principles of federalism? How do you maintain, and how might we better maintain any sense of optimism looking forward? Thank you.
Do we have any takers?
I mean, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, look, I think we live in challenging times. There's no question about that. But maybe it's just having been raised in the Reagan generation of kids. I still believe America's a shining city on the hill. I've read a lot of history. I know that there are periods of history in American history where we're going through challenging times, and we've come out of those. I tell you, one of the things that gives me great confidence is the judiciary. I mean, that sounds biased, but there are a lot of incredible jurists, and I'm sitting with two on this panel, and there's some out in this audience who are fiercely dedicated to the rule of law, who are willing to make unpopular decisions. And so, I think I get a lot of comfort from the incredible public service that a lot of my colleagues are given at both the federal and state level.
I had the joy a couple weeks ago, 2 weeks ago today, of interviewing Justice Barrett about her new book, Listening to the Law. The final 7 words of her book are, "I remain optimistic." She's talking about the Constitution. "I remain optimistic about its continued success." And I asked her, what undergirds your optimism? What grounds your optimism? And she gave a characteristically eloquent response. I mentioned the remark of a sitting senator in my comments earlier. That is on the heels a few years earlier of another unnamed U.S. senator, who I think happens to be the minority leader, who said on one of the Sunday morning talk shows, he was kind of railing about something, and he says, "We have 3 branches of government. We have a House." You see where this is going. "We have a Senate, and we have a president." And I'm like, come on, man. What about...
That's how it feels sometimes.
I know. What about my branch? The branch, my daughter calls it the branch with the costumes. What about the judiciary? I think there's a tunnel vision. There's a kind of a smug sort of tone deafness that comes with wielding power. And I think that is often married with just kind of the foundational illiteracy of not knowing our roots. And I think that's a toxic mix. I think as the founders understood, the survival of freedom depends not on parchment, not words on dry paper, but on people, generation after generation. And I think that's why epic anniversaries like America 250 matter. They remind us what makes America unique in the history of the world. And forgetting that, again, isn't just bad history, it's dangerous politics. I wrote a thing for Constitution Day a couple years ago, co-wrote it with my circuit colleague on another circuit, Bernice Donald. So you've got, well, gee, what could these 2 federal circuit judges have in common? You've got what some would view as a progressive black woman Obama appointee and a conservative white male Trump appointee. What could they possibly agree on? So we wrote this piece for the Washington Post about how we can, pardon my scratchy voice, how we can kind of get toward this more perfect union. And we listed 5 things. We said, number 1, log off. That we live in this age of tribalism, and the art of disagreeing agreeably seems quaint and old-fashioned. We see all this online snarling and sneering and sniping, but enough about Judge Diller's Twitter account. But that does spill over into real life, and when opposing views become no longer debatable, they become disreputable. They become the views that only a truly evil person would hold. I think democracy suffers. So number 1, log off. And number 2, learn up. And we talked about the civic illiteracy in America. The judicial branch is the least understood, especially by those who kind of increasingly seem to characterize it as hijacked by craven kind of partisanship. I think the facts are hostile witnesses. At my level, 99% of all federal litigation comes to a screeching halt in the federal circuit courts. And 98% of those 99% are 3-0. They're unanimous. And I think that level of unanimity ought to be heartening to a lot of people who think that my branch has been hijacked by partisan point scoring. So it's hardly the caricature that a lot of people kind of paint it as. So Number one, log off, and number two, learn up, and number three, Judge Donald and I wrote about reaching out, because cross-party friendships today, across the aisle friendships, are so incredibly rare. There was a survey that NBC News did a couple years ago that said most college students would not even choose as a roommate somebody who voted opposite them in the most recent presidential election. And Americans often, we hunker down in these echo chambers and we marinate in confirmation bias, and we don't really ever seem to encounter, much less befriend, anybody who sees the world differently than we do. So cross-party friendships are no easy feat, but I think if Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg can do it, I think we can too. Number four, we said pull back. Everybody views everything in life through this political prism today. Entire identities get distilled to partisan labels. I think it's true that civic and religious institutions in America have sort of thinned out, and I think politics sort of rushes into that vacuum. So I think we all have this innate desire for connection and togetherness and belonging, and I think as civic institutions thin out, politics kind of fills that vacuum for a lot of people. Political strife isn't anything new in America, but I think the intensity of what we have now is really, the radical intensification is really striking. And then finally, we said to plug in. There's a famous Georgian, you may have heard of him, Jimmy Carter, who said, the only title in our democracy superior to that of president is the title of citizen. And Justice Brandeis made a similar point many years ago. But American citizenship is not a spectator sport. And we need engaged, not enraged, not enfeebled, but engaged citizens, not bystanders. And we live in a pretty raucous, rough and tumble republic sometimes, and it belongs to all of us. And it's ours to keep and it's ours to lose. And the secret sauce is a sleeves rolled up citizenry. So my hope that Judge Donald and I wrote about was that as we approach this America 250 anniversary, that if there's any identity that should define us as Americans, let it be one that sort of transcends our demographic and ideological differences, which ought to be our common identity as inheritors to this really rich, glorious, civic inheritance we all share.
Judge Willett, that is great. Before we go to the next question, I'm going to ask Professor Chapman to weigh in briefly on this as well, given that you are an educator and you were educating the next generation of lawyers. Are you seeing trends that make you hopeful about increased understanding and appreciation of our system of government? Please be positive. We are hoping there's a positive answer.
Yeah, I'm not optimistic.
We did not prepare for this.
But I am hopeful.
You can't tell.
I am hopeful. So there are a lot of things in America that are better for a lot of people than they were 50 years ago. But our governmental structure and the constitutional norms that we depend on to remain free, to remain prosperous, are, under assault to some extent. And it seems like a lot of people don't care, to be honest. Or they care a lot and they're the ones with the hammers. But my students care. And the students who are here care, the students who would have shown up to the sort of opposite side version of this event care. They seem to get along with one another. This event makes me hopeful, to be honest. Lawyers are committed to accurate speech. They're committed to seeing the world accurately and describing it accurately, to speaking sincerely. Those are hallmarks of how procedure leads to something approximating justice. And we instill those in law students. And it will take courage for a lot of young lawyers, a lot of folks in this room who are not young. It will take courage from. But I'm hopeful that there's a remnant that will be able to sort of, withstand the current stuff. And as Judge Dillard said, it's easy to sort of idolize the past to some extent, or romanticize the past, and we forget that this isn't, our first merry-go-round with some very difficult threats to the rule of law.
Thank you for that hopeful message. All right, we'll do another question, and if y'all don't mind introducing yourselves before you ask the question, that would be beneficial as well. We have somebody over here. And
I'll have a question because you got me just a second ago.
Intended to be the last question. I'm David DeLugas and a Duke graduate as well.
Let's go.
For the historians on the panel, is it true that King George actually said, "You'll be back"?
I think he sang it.
You have another one over here.
Hi, my name's Aiden Katz. I'm actually a clerk for Judge Branch.
Wonderful.
My question has to do with, so the Declaration, we all know, protects 3 inalienable rights: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And after that, it says that to secure that governments are instituted among men to secure these rights. But then right after that, it said, whenever government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish that form of government, and to institute new government, laying its foundations upon such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their future safety and happiness. Now, although framed as a right, that also has an implied power, it seems to me, behind it, the power of the people to alter or to abolish their form of government. And I find that a lot of the conversation about how the Declaration fits into how we interpret the Constitution talks a lot about rights, the Ninth Amendment and so on, and sort of the rights protected in the Bill of Rights, but not a lot about powers. And in this case, I'm thinking about the 10th Amendment, the reservation of power to the people. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how that declaration of implied power to the people might help us interpret the reserved powers to the people in the 10th Amendment.
It's a great question.
I think more about the reservation in the Ninth Amendment, because that's really talking about the rights we retain as a people, separate and apart from any powers that are reserved to the states. So I would frame it more in the Ninth Amendment area. When I was at Duke, I did some really interesting, we had a class on the Second Amendment, and when we usually think about the Second Amendment, we think about the right of self-defense, but one of the other rights that historically understood within the Second Amendment is the right of revolution. And so that's not real popular to talk about, but it's there historically. So it would be a little weird to say that, we started this country through revolution and that's not still an available right to the people. I think it would certainly have to be extreme circumstances to warrant, kind of the invocation of that right. But at least theoretically, I think it's still there.
I think the Constitution is chock full of procedural mechanisms that effectively give work like escape valves or something like that on the popular pressure for change, from the amendment process to the way the separation of powers incorporates republicanism. And with respect to the revolutionary right, I would just say I think most of the founders would have agreed with John Locke that it should be exercised in only the most extreme circumstances. They start off by saying, we've been put out of the constitutional situation. We're not putting ourselves out of it. Now, that may be just rhetorical license, but Locke ultimately says, look, the only one who can really judge between the people and the ruler, if the people think they ought to be able to revolt, is God. And generally, he's not telling until the final judgment. And so, the revolutionaries, I think, believed that, and they thought they were taking their chances, but they also, that was one reason why providentialism was such an important part of their movement.
Bunch of smarty pants in the branch chambers, it sounds like.
Unsurprising.
Hi, Ivan Sirison. Thank you very much for coming. Sort of going on that topic, do you think that the revolution would have been ideologically possible without the English Civil Wars and the glorious revolutions of the previous century?
I don't think so. I think the Americans inherited basically the sort of Calvinist branch of the Protestant Reformation and the way it had been shaped through those civil wars, then as it was kind of shaped through Cato, who was less overtly religious, but sort of led to a kind of Whiggish approach to Lockeanism. And it was all part of, that was what Americans inherited that made them conservative and made the Brits, on the one hand, they're radical liberals. On the other hand, they're deeply conservative in their view of what the English Constitution requires.
My name's Ben Minner. I'm with the firm of Clark Hill with my partners Brian Jagto and Brian Tyson. I have a question about the precedential value of the list of grievances. So, and that's the term I can best think of because it's come to me on the spot. But I used to teach constitutional law and the legal system in undergraduate courses. And in talking about the Declaration, I was always fascinated by how many of the grievances were focused on law or denials of law or issues of law. And so I wonder, to the extent that we still have a right of revolution and that is claimed, say, by California, or that it was claimed by the Confederates, to what extent does a revolution have to go back and look at the list of grievances and say, look, it's great that everyone has this right, but it has to really be, to go to your point, Professor Chapman, about the extreme circumstances. Like, do you have to look to the grievances to kind of really understand what kind of circumstances are extreme, and does it really have to be like denial of law type circumstances?
The grievance, that was my daughter's favorite part to memorize, was the grievances, because it was like a literal indictment of the crown, right? Just count after count after count. And you're right, a bunch of them were law-related, including what? Making judges dependent on his will alone was one of them. This was like the Festivus of 17. I've got a lot of problems with you people, and now you're going to hear about it. Sorry, it's a digression. I hadn't thought about your question before, but my daughter loved kind of thundering about the grievances, especially all the legal ones, and she would look over at me. I was wearing this scratchy colonial costume, because I was reciting the Declaration to a bunch of fourth graders who were reciting back in their little tiny, cute fourth grade voices. And then my daughter flexed on everybody and just recited the whole thing. But you're right, a bunch of them are law-related, but the ongoing precedential value, I don't know. I would defer to Professor Chapman on that stuff. But it was a literal, this is like a noose-inviting, treasonous indictment of the crown. And they were pledging lives and fortunes and sacred honors to do this. So they were putting their neck in the noose when they did it.
And I think, too, there's a very different, you mentioned like California, like we were dealing with, people that were ruling us from far away. I think that's certainly a different context. And I think the good professor and I, once again, I'm in complete agreement with him. It would have to be extreme circumstances to kind of invoke this right of rebellion or right of revolution. But to your point in terms of precedent, and the other thing, too, you have to recognize is even if there is this right, there's also a good chance that, just as in the Civil War, your attempt to exercise that can be quelled. I mean, it can be shut down. And so I think it's maybe interesting to think about in theoretical terms. I think the likelihood. Now, the more interesting question is kind of looking at these past grievances to the extent that they fit into more interesting kind of procedural buckets that are still, that have a hook in the federal constitution or in our state constitutions? I think that's an interesting question.
And I would just briefly note, part of what I said earlier was about the ways in which there was this shared understanding of constitutionalism and yet deep difference. And I think that's a persistent feature of civil wars and revolutions, is that you have a community that has a shared tradition and a shared language for thinking about the law and political responsibility. And yet there grows a sort of unbridgeable divide among them. And I think that for the purposes of, a coherent society long-term, that's the thing to try to avoid, and try to find common ground and educate with an eye towards that, especially when there are a great deal of pressures, some of which are just, natural, economic and political, but some of which are ideological, that are oriented towards undermining trust in law, just generally speaking, trust in the judiciary, trust in lawyers. Law just becomes a tool of another, continuation of war by other means.
Well said.
We have time for one or two more. Adam, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you, Justice. My name is Adam Bartnicki, president of the Georgia Student Chapter, as well as extern to Presiding Justice Warren. Much of the discussion this afternoon is focused on the Declaration's impact on our nation and our nation's history. But Judge Willett, as well as Professor Chapman, expressed that the Declaration includes world-changing language and ideas. And I was curious if any of you could speak to the effects the Declaration of Independence has had outside the U.S. Since 1776.
Yeah, the Declaration was never just an American statement. It was a human statement, and reflecting this innate human desire for individual freedom, which is, the essential condition for human flourishing. The Declaration is the most imitated political statement, political text in history. I think scholars estimate that over 100 plus independence movements around the globe have borrowed from our Declaration. So the Declaration didn't just found a single country. It really launched this broader idea, this broader conception of human beings and human government. Jefferson called it an expression of the American mind, as I mentioned, but I think it's also, even more broadly, an expression of kind of the human mind and that inborn kind of insatiable hunger for freedom. In Tiananmen Square, 30 years ago, I'd just begun law school in the summer of '89, before many of you were even born. That's a long time ago. But those students in Tiananmen Square were talking about unalienable rights. And I don't think they were doing it just because they were parroting us, but because those words had become sort of a universal shorthand, sort of this grammar, this vocabulary, a shorthand for human dignity and for self-rule. So the Declaration is certainly deeply American, but I think it's also deeply and radically universal. I mean, in the preamble, Jefferson talks about appealing to the opinion of mankind when he kind of sets forth the reasons for separation. And that's why you have dissidents, whether they're in Warsaw or Manila or Havana or wherever they may be, they kind of hear that echo, those ripple effects, that grammar of freedom, which I think every human heart understands kind of instinctively. So yeah, the Declaration was American, and it changed America, but I think it also, to your point, kind of changed the world. and it kind of gave liberty this common vocabulary. And I think wherever people are yearning to breathe free, I think those ideals are still stirring to them.
I think that is a great place to end. My understanding is that we are going to take about a 15-minute break and reconvene for our fireside chat at 3:45. Before we do, let's please give our panelists a great round of applause.